The events of February 1993 in Merseyside, England, they mark a moment that profoundly shocked the public and forced a really uncomfortable look at childhood, at crime, and at justice. Today we're beginning a very careful examination of the sources surrounding the tragic murder of 2-year-old James Patrick Bulger.
It is absolutely critical that we approach this material with the seriousness it demands. It's one of the most documented and controversial criminal cases in modern British history. James Bulger was abducted and then killed on the 12th of February, 1993. The investigation that followed revealed the perpetrators were Robert Thompson and John Venables.
And at the time of the crime, both of these boys were just 10 years old. Their conviction made them, at that point, the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. It really set the stage for decades of debate.
Our focus today, for you, is to really review the facts and the documentation very thoroughly. We're aiming to look beyond that initial shock, to understand the legal precedents that were challenged, the intense political interference that happened afterwards, and, the deep ethical questions about juvenile justice that are still unfolding.
So let's unpack this chronologically, starting with the horrifying details of the abduction and the crime itself, drawing directly from the sources we've compiled.
The sources placed James Bulger at the New Strand Shopping Center in Bootle. He was with his mother, Denise, on the afternoon of Friday, February 12th.
Just a completely normal, mundane family, outing that, in a split second, ended in unimaginable tragedy.
The disappearance is documented very precisely. It happened at around 3:40 p.m. James's mother, Denise, she let go of his hand for just a moment while she was paying for something at a butcher shop.
A.R. Tim's butcher's shop, right?
That's the one. And in that brief window, Thompson and Venables, who were playing truant from school, they saw their chance.
And crucially, this moment was witnessed, in a way. It was captured by closed-circuit television. The footage, time-stamped just 2 minutes later at 3:42 p.m., showed the two 10-year-old boys taking James by the hand and simply walking him away.
That CCTV footage, as grainy and low-resolution as it was, it became the defining image of the whole tragedy. And what the sources really emphasize about those first moments is this sense of calculated opportunism. The reports state the boys were seen, and I'm quoting here, casually observing children, apparently selecting a target.
Wow, so they weren't just wandering aimlessly.
No, they were actively looking for a vulnerable child.
That one detail, selecting a target, it completely changes the perception of the act, doesn't it? It moves it from just some spontaneous act of mischief into something far more premeditated.
It does. And that premeditation, it extends to their initial plan. We know from the source material that one of the boys later admitted their original idea was to abduct a child, lead him to a busy road right near the shopping center, and then intentionally push him into traffic.
So the intent to cause serious, even fatal harm was there from the beginning, even before they decided on the railway line.
Exactly. And you also see the petty crimes they committed that day feeding directly into the murder itself. The sources detail how they shoplifted several items that morning: sweets, batteries, a little troll doll, and, most chillingly, a can of blue Humbrol modeling paint.
And these seemingly insignificant items, they become grim forensic evidence later on.
It's a terrible example of how planning and the means to carry out that plan just converged.
Now let's talk about the journey that happened after the abduction. Thompson and Venables walked with James Bulger for 2.5 miles. That's around 4 kilometers across Liverpool.
It's a long public walk. And the truly astonishing fact is that during this entire journey, the sources estimate they were seen by approximately 38 separate people.
38. 38 chances for someone to intervene or just question what they were seeing, which was a crying toddler with 2 older boys.
And this really points to a disturbing sense of public inaction, or maybe a reluctance to challenge what people assumed was just a family squabble or a minor incident. When bystanders did question them,
they had their story ready.
They did. They used manipulation. They claimed James was either their lost brother or a lost child they were responsibly taking to a police station. And this really highlights something that came up in the trial. They had an awareness of how adult authority works and how to manipulate it to keep control of James.
But the abuse, it had started long before they reached that final, awful location. Near the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, just a short walk from the shopping center, the sources record the first clear acts of physical violence.
That's right. They dropped James on his head there, which caused noticeable facial injuries. An eyewitness described him at that point as crying his eyes out. The boys were even heard joking about pushing him into the canal. This early violence just shows how quickly their cruelty was escalating.
The journey finally ended in the Walton area of Liverpool, and it's truly chilling when you realize they paused directly across the street from the Walton Lane police station.
It's as if they were confirming where the danger was or realizing they couldn't be seen going in. From there, they led James up a steep embankment to a secluded railway line.
And once they reached that isolated spot, the sustained, horrifying torture began. The sources, they go into grim detail here, and they confirm that the items they'd shoplifted earlier were used.
Yes, the blue Humbrol paint was thrown into James's left eye.
They then subjected him to just brutal, prolonged violence, kicking him, stamping on him, throwing bricks and stones at him. They even forced batteries into his mouth. The sheer amount of trauma was immense.
The pathologist's report, which was presented in court by Dr. Alan Williams, documented a total of 42 separate injuries all over James's body. This was not a quick, single event. It was a sustained attack.
And the most severe injury involved a piece of railway equipment.
A railway fish plate. A massive 10-kilogram, that's about 22 pounds piece of iron, was dropped on James. That one act caused 10 skull fractures. But the pathologist noted that because of the sheer extent of all the other trauma, the kicking, the stoning, the stomping, it was impossible to definitively identify a single fatal blow.
So the prosecution argued that the cumulative trauma of all 42 injuries was the cause of death.
Correct. And the court accepted that. After the murder, the boys then attempted a clear cover-up, which suggests they had an immediate awareness that what they'd done was deeply wrong.
They laid his body across the railway tracks and weighted his head down with rubble.
The intention was clearly to make the death look like an accident, caused by a passing train. However, forensic examination later confirmed that James had already died from his injuries before his body was struck and severed by the train. So the cover-up failed scientifically, but it certainly demonstrated what the law calls mischievous discretion, which would become a key point in the trial.
His body was discovered 2 days later, and tragically, it wasn't by an organized police search, but by 4 young boys who were just looking for lost footballs near the tracks.
We should also note that police initially suspected a sexual assault. This was a point of significant contention in the sources. James's shoes, his socks, trousers, and underpants had all been removed.
And the pathologist reported that his foreskin had been forcibly pulled back.
Right. The source had confirmed that when Thompson and Venables were later questioned about what happened on the railway line, they were extremely reluctant to discuss this specific element of the crime. Even Venables' psychiatrist, years later, noted his continued denial of any sexual element to what happened. It's an ambiguity that added yet another layer of horror to an already shocking crime.
So the police investigation, it was instantly a massive, high-pressure operation.
It was. And the initial leads, based on that very grainy CCTV, they proved disastrous. The low quality of the images led to false accusations. The sources document the terrible consequence of this. One innocent family was forced to flee their home due to intense vigilante threats.
It wasn't until those images were enhanced and released nationally that the critical breakthrough came. A woman recognized John Venables. She remembered him playing truant with Robert Thompson in that area.
And her tip led police directly to the 2 boys. Once they had the suspects, the forensic evidence quickly became conclusive. The sources highlight 2 major links. First, that distinctive blue Humbrol paint from the scene was found on both boys' clothing.
And second, the blood.
Yes. The blood found on Robert Thompson's shoe was matched to James Bulger's DNA.
That's undeniable evidence, but the sources provide even more specific physical links that detail exactly how the attack unfolded.
Exactly. The forensic experts were able to match the physical trauma to the boys' footwear. There was a specific pattern of bruising on James's right cheek that correlated precisely with the features of the upper part of a shoe worn by Thompson.
Wow.
And in addition, paint marks found inside the toe cap of one of Venables' shoes suggested that he had used some force, as they put it, when kicking James.
The shoes told the story. They were charged with murder on February 20th, 1993. The sources relay a very poignant detail about a comment Thompson made to the police. He asked if they had taken James to the hospital to get him alive again.
And that comment, it speaks to the huge legal and psychological challenge facing the courts. Was this a genuine expression of childish remorse? Or was it a calculated question to see if his crime had been successful? They were officially anonymized as Child A, who was Thompson, and Child B, Venables, for the initial media reports.
The trial itself opened on November 1st, 1993. And this is where the case really transitions from a horrific crime story into a landmark legal challenge that exposed these deep fault lines in the British justice system.
The decision was made to conduct the trial as an adult trial at Sessions House in Preston, and the environment was immediately problematic for children that age. The sources describe the scene. The judge, Mr. Justice Moreland, and all the court officials were in full traditional legal regalia.
And outside, the atmosphere was just poisonous, with up to 500 protesters gathering, shouting for vengeance.
Right. And the physical setup inside the courtroom only compounded that intimidation. The two 11-year-old defendants sat in the dock, a space designed for adult criminals, and they were physically separated from their parents. They actually needed raised chairs just to see out over the barrier.
All while being flanked by social workers and guards.
This whole setup, as we know, became the basis of a successful appeal to the European Court of Human Rights later on, precisely because it failed to accommodate the vulnerability of the children.
Now, the central legal battle here was this principle of doli incapax. It's really important for you to understand this because it's so fundamental to juvenile law.
Doli incapax is a presumption in common law. It basically assumes that children under the age of 14 are inherently incapable of forming criminal intent. The law presumes they can't distinguish between serious wrongdoing and just, mischief.
So the burden of proof is entirely on the prosecution to shatter that presumption?
Completely. And in this case, the prosecution successfully rebutted doli incapax by arguing that Thompson and Venables were capable of mischievous discretion.
Mischievous discretion. That's such a loaded phrase.
It is. It means the court decided that the boys, despite their age, were mature enough to understand that what they were doing was seriously wrong, not just misbehavior. That they had the criminal intent to commit the murder and then to cover it up.
So what evidence did the prosecution lean on to prove that?
Primarily two things. First, the extensive nature of the violence and the deliberate choice of a remote location, which indicated planning and evasion. And second, the attempted cover-up, laying the body on the tracks to fake an accident. A child who can engineer a complex cover-up is seen as understanding the consequences of their actions.
And they also had powerful psychiatric testimony on their side.
They did. Child psychiatrist Eileen Vizard testified that Thompson, while suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, did know the difference between right and wrong. And Susan Bailey, who interviewed Venables, stated unequivocally that he knew the difference.
And the boys themselves, they remained silent throughout the trial. They didn't take the stand. So the prosecution's entire case relied on external evidence.
Especially the more than 20 hours of tape-recorded police interviews that were played in court. Those tapes provided the narrative. We also see some early signs of them shifting blame. Venables' solicitor later controversially compared Thompson to the Pied Piper, suggesting Thompson was the dominant leader.
An attempt to lessen Venables' role, which ultimately failed.
It did. The sources also include a chilling detail about Venables' after-court appearances. He would apparently strip off his clothes and say, "I can smell James like a baby smells." Whether this was genuine psychological distress or something else, it just underscored the instability of the defendants.
On November 24th, 1993, the jury returned a guilty verdict. They were convicted of murder. They were 11 years old.
Mr. Justice Moreland, the trial judge, he called the crime one of unparalleled evil and barbarity. He sentenced them to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is essentially an indeterminate sentence for juveniles.
And he recommended a minimum term, or tariff, of 8 years in custody.
Right. But he also made another pivotal, highly controversial decision. He lifted the reporting restrictions, allowing their names to be published. He said this was because the public interest in informed debate overrode the defendant's interest in anonymity.
And that single decision to name Thompson and Venables, that was really the spark that ignited the intense media and political firestorm that came next.
The judge's recommendation of an 8-year minimum term meant Thompson and Venables could potentially be out at age 18. This was met with immediate public outrage.
And that outrage quickly translated into political pressure.
The standard legal process would see the recommendation move from the trial judge, who suggested 8 years, up to the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Taylor, he increased it slightly, to 10 years. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy the public mood.
And this is where the relationship between the courts and the government gets very fraught. The Sun newspaper launched a massive public campaign. They gathered nearly 280,000 signatures on a petition demanding a much longer sentence,
which they then handed directly to the Home Secretary at the time, Michael Howard. And Howard chose to intervene directly. In July 1994, he unilaterally announced that he was increasing the minimum tariff to 15 years.
So, an executive decision overriding judicial recommendations, this meant they wouldn't be eligible for release until they were 25?
Right. And this action was widely criticized. Lord Donaldson's quote is very telling here. He called the increased tariff institutionalized vengeance by a politician playing to the gallery.
It was seen as the politicization of punishment.
It was. And it took 3 years, but the House of Lords ultimately overturned Howard's intervention in 1997. They ruled it was unlawful for the Home Secretary to decide minimum sentences for young offenders. It reestablished the separation of powers, but it showed how powerful public pressure could be.
The media influence wasn't just on sentencing either. The case also fueled a massive moral panic about violent videos in the 1990s. Judge Moreland himself suggested that the boys' actions might have been encouraged by what they watched.
The tabloids immediately jumped on the Child Play 3 allegations. They claimed the use of the blue paint in the murder was directly inspired by a scene in that film. It was a very easy, sensational headline that provided a simple explanation for incredibly complex behavior.
But the police findings completely dismantled that link.
They did. The police reviewed the 200 video titles rented by the Venables family and found no specific scene or plot that could be definitively linked to motivating the murder. Inspector Ray Simpson's comment really cuts through the hysteria. He said, "If you are going to link this murder to a film, you might as well link it to the railway children."
Still, that public alarm did contribute to legislative changes, specifically the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, which tightened the rules on video availability.
Given all this intense adult-driven scrutiny, it's not surprising that the defendant's case was taken to the European Court of Human Rights. In 1999, their lawyers argued the trial was fundamentally unfair because of their age and the intimidating adult setting.
And the ECHR ruling was a landmark decision. It validated the criticism of the original trial. They upheld the claim that the boys were denied a fair trial.
The court's wording was very explicit. They said, "The public trial process in an adult court must be regarded in the case of an 11-year-old child as a severely intimidating procedure." It essentially forced the UK to acknowledge that its legal procedures had failed to protect the defendant's rights as children.
It's important to remember that James Bulger's parents also went to the ECHR. They wanted victims to have a right to be involved in sentencing.
But they failed to persuade the court. The ECHR's decision focused strictly on the rights of the defendants within the judicial process.
So following that ruling and the overturning of Michael Howard's 15-year tariff, the sentence had to be recalculated. In October 2000, the new Lord Chief Justice, Harry Wolff, he reduced the tariffs back down to the 8 years that was originally envisioned.
Which meant that by June 2001, the parole board determined that Thompson and Venables were no longer a threat to public safety. Having served the 8-year minimum, they were eligible for release.
They were released on life license just weeks later, at the age of 18, and the practicalities of this release were just extraordinary. Because their names and faces were so well known and their safety was deemed to be at severe risk, they were placed into a kind of witness protection scheme.
It was a program that involved fabricating entirely new identities. This meant creating new passports, national insurance numbers, qualification certificates, medical records, a complete governmental overhaul of their entire history to ensure their anonymity.
The conditions of their life license were very strict. They were prohibited from contacting each other or the Bulger family. They were forbidden from visiting Merseyside. They had curfews, and they had to report regularly to probation officers.
And this leads to the most critical part of the post-release structure: the worldwide injunction. This injunction prevents the publication of their new identities or their locations. It was justified by the Home Secretary at the time, who said there was a real and strong possibility that their lives would be at risk if their anonymity was ever compromised. It's perhaps the single most complex legal protection ever granted to convicted criminals in the UK.
The shadow of this tragedy, of course, had devastating consequences for James's family. The sources confirmed that his parents, Ralph and Denise Bulger, divorced in 1995. The intense trauma of the trial and everything that followed was just too much for the marriage.
Both parents did later remarry and have more children, but James's mother, Denise Fergus, she became a very prominent figure in victim activism. In 2008, for example, she launched an appeal to set up a Red Balloon Learner Center in James's memory to help children struggling with trauma.
The case also continues to fuel major policy debates about the age of criminal responsibility. In 2010, the Children's Commissioner for England called for raising that age from 10 to 12.
Yes, arguing that the killers should have been managed through programs rather than formal prosecution. But the Ministry of Justice firmly rejected that. They cited the Bulger case as the defining example of why the age should remain at 10, stating that children over 10 know the difference between bad behavior and serious wrongdoing. That concept of mischievous discretion just casts a very long shadow.
And the mechanism designed to protect the perpetrators, that worldwide injunction, it has proven to be constantly vulnerable in the digital age.
Constantly. Even early on, before the internet made things so complicated, the Manchester Evening News was fined £30,000 for publishing details that hinted at where Thompson and Venables were being held.
But once the internet really exploded, the anonymity system began facing constant attacks. The sources list multiple instances of false identification that put completely innocent people at serious risk.
In 2010, a man got a suspended sentence for falsely identifying a former colleague as Thompson on Facebook. And the judge stressed, this wasn't just defamation, it put an innocent person at significant risk of serious harm from vigilantes. We've seen this happen again and again, with people posting photos online claiming they're of Thompson or Venables as adults.
The cruelty was often aimed at the victim's family, too. In 2016, a woman was jailed for sending cruel messages to Denise Fergus on Twitter, posing as one of the killers and, disturbingly, as James Bulger's ghost.
This constant battle to maintain these secret identities, it underscores the incredible difficulty and cost of the measure. However, the most severe public safety concerns revolve not around the anonymity breaches, but around the pattern of reoffending by John Venables.
His life on license was unstable almost immediately after his 2001 release. The sources detail a decade of escalating risk behavior before he was first recalled to prison.
He started drinking excessively, taking drugs, and critically, he repeatedly breached the condition that prohibited him from visiting Merseyside, which risked immediate identification.
By 2008, his misdemeanors were becoming public. He was arrested after a fight outside a nightclub, and a few months later, he was cautioned for cocaine possession. This whole period just shows a clear failure to abide by the structure of his release.
And that structure completely collapsed in February 2010. A probation officer visited his flat, and Venables was found attempting to physically destroy his computer's hard drive with a knife and a tin opener.
A very suspicious act, which led to the seizure of his computer and the discovery of extremely serious child pornography offenses.
The scope of the material was horrifying. He had downloaded 57 indecent images over a year, some of which depicted the rape of children as young as 2. This was not a minor offense. It was a serious continuation of offenses against children.
He pleaded guilty, and details emerged that he was actively pursuing this material, posing in online chat rooms as a 35-year-old woman named Dawn Smith. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison.
Following this catastrophic failure, a review was commissioned to investigate the probation service's handling of the case, and its findings were stark. They concluded that short of 24-hour surveillance, the officers could not have prevented the downloads. The system just proved insufficient against the dangers of online criminality.
Because of the high risk of exposure after that 2010 sentencing, the security around Venables had to be ramped up even further. In 2011, he was granted a second new identity after his first one was compromised. The state had to erase him all over again.
But despite being released, the cycle repeated. Venables was recalled to prison again in November 2017 for possessing more child sexual abuse imagery.
In 2018, he pleaded guilty to making indecent images of children and possessing a pedophile manual, a document providing advice on child grooming and evading detection. He was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months.
And he remains incarcerated. He's been repeatedly denied parole in 2020 and again in late 2023. The parole board explicitly stated that his release would not be safe for the protection of the public. His danger is explicitly recognized as ongoing.
The cost of protecting his anonymity continues to spiral. In 2019, British officials facing huge legal fees considered resettling Venables overseas.
An idea that was met with international resistance. New Zealand's Prime Minister at the time, Jacinda Ardern, publicly advised Venables, "Don't bother applying." It showed that this problem is a global one.
Meanwhile, James's father, Ralph Bulger, lost a legal challenge in 2019 to have Venables' anonymity lifted. The judge maintained the order, ruling that lifting it would likely result in grave and possibly fatal consequences. The paradox remains. The state must protect the life of a dangerous criminal from the public he endangers.
Given the intense, enduring public fascination, it's inevitable that the murder of James Bulger has been referenced and adapted across various media, often triggering renewed pain for the family.
And these portrayals highlight that agonizing conflict between artistic interpretation and the very real trauma of those affected. An early example was a 2001 stage play, The Age of Consent.
It featured a character who had committed a crime almost identical to the Bulger murder. Denise Fergus publicly denounced it, saying it was just designed to try and shock people.
The playwright, on the other hand, argued it was a serious moral examination of society. It really highlights that difficult boundary between commentary and exploitation.
Another adaptation, a 2008 Swedish play called Monsters. It used the actual interrogation transcripts of the murderers and their families as its source material, trying to recreate the psychological reality of the event.
The case even found its way into video games. In 2007, a Law and Order computer game had to be withdrawn in the UK.
Because it inadvertently included the actual, unedited CCTV image of James Bulger's abduction. The developer apologized, saying they were unaware of the crime, which had received less publicity in the US.
Australian television also showed poor judgment. In 2009, a network used the real abduction footage to promote a crime drama, leading to a public outcry.
And they also openly speculated about Thompson and Venables living in Australia, which prompted an official government denial. The sensitivity around their anonymity is truly global.
And most recently, there was the international controversy surrounding the 2019 Oscars and the short film Detainment.
Detainment was nominated for Best Live-Action Short Film, and it was structured entirely around the transcripts of the police interviews with Thompson and Venables.
James Bulger's mother was not consulted before the film's release or its nomination. She publicly condemned the film and circulated a petition calling for it to be removed.
The director refused to withdraw it, arguing it was intended to explore the capacity for evil in children. But the incident was a potent global reminder of how the narrative surrounding a crime can so often re-traumatize the victim's family.
The murder of James Bulger was a pivotal, painful case that redefined how the UK handles its youngest offenders. It stretched the limits of justice and challenged the balance between political will and judicial independence.
And the key tension remains the long-term failure of rehabilitation, specifically for John Venables. The system determined he was no longer a threat at age 18, and it granted him a completely fabricated new life. Yet that second chance led to repeated, serious offenses, proving that the risk assessment and supervision just failed catastrophically.
The European Court of Human Rights found the adult trial was intimidating for an 11-year-old, so the system failed to treat them as children. But at the same time, the successful rebuttal of Doli Incapax suggests these same children were operating with a cold awareness of serious wrongdoing.
And that paradox is the enduring dilemma. How do you treat offenders who commit atrocious crimes as children, but who also demonstrate an ability for premeditation and a cover-up? The Bulger case is the constant, painful counterpoint to arguments for raising the age of criminal responsibility.
If the ECHR was right that the adult trial was severely intimidating for an 11-year-old, compromising their right to a fair trial, how does society reconcile that institutional failure with the fact that the adult one of them became has repeatedly proven too dangerous to release? It seems the system failed both to protect the child defendant's rights and to guarantee public safety from the adult criminal.
An incredibly challenging legacy that continues to shape law and public debate to this day.
Thanks for listening.